Welcome to my channel. Subscribe and enjoy daily stories about cheating, revenge, and relationship advice. The house was too quiet that night. The kind of quiet that feels suffocating, where even the faint ticking of the wall clock seems too loud. I sat on the worn leather couch, staring blankly at a half-read book resting on my lap. My glass of wine sat untouched on the coffee table, the red liquid catching the dim light of the fireplace. I wasn't really in the mood for reading anymore, or anything for that matter. Brad had been gone for hours. Not that it mattered. He came and went as he pleased, like we were roommates who barely tolerated each other's presence. Our marriage had been dead for years. I couldn't even pinpoint when it happened. It was more of a slow, inevitable decay. At first, I'd cared, tried to fix things. But now, I was just biding my time. I glanced at the clock, 10:17 p.m. Brad wouldn't be home anytime soon. I let out a long sigh and reached for my wine glass. As the rich liquid warmed my throat, I couldn't stop my mind from drifting to Nick. God, I wished I were with him instead. His touch, his laugh, everything with him was the opposite of the dull, gray world I lived in with Brad. I'd been seeing Nick for months, sneaking around behind Brad's back, and I didn't feel an ounce of guilt about it. Why should I? It wasn't like Brad cared about me anymore. Just as I was sinking back into my thoughts, a loud, insistent knock shattered the silence. I froze, the wine glass halfway to my lips. The knock came again, harder this time, making the door rattle in its frame. My heart jumped, and for a second, I considered ignoring it. Who the hell would be visiting this late? But something about the urgency in the knock made me push myself off the couch. I walked toward the door, each step making the knot in my stomach tighten. When I opened it, I was met by the sight of Ethan, Brad's friend from work. He was standing stiffly on my doorstep, his face pale, the collar of his jacket pulled up against the cold. Next to him stood Officer Greg, a tall, broad-shouldered cop I recognized from around town. His expression was unreadable, his hands clasped in front of him like he was bracing for something unpleasant. "Tara," Ethan said, his voice low and somber, the way people talk when they're about to deliver bad news. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "What's going on?" Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward Officer Greg, who shifted awkwardly before speaking. "Mrs. Campbell," he began, "there's been an incident involving your husband." My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to feel dread, but instead, something else bubbled up, a sickening thrill. Could this be it? Could it really be over? What kind of incident? I asked, trying to sound concerned, though I wasn't sure how well I pulled it off. Ethan cleared his throat, taking a step forward. "Brad was driving out by the lake this evening. His car went through the ice." My mind immediately jumped to the image of Brad's car sinking into the freezing water, the ice cracking beneath its weight. I pictured him struggling, trying to claw his way out before the water swallowed him whole. I should have felt panic, or sadness, or something. But all I felt was a strange sense of release, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had just lifted. I put a hand to my mouth, pretending to stifle a gasp. "Oh my God. Is he?" Ethan shook his head. "They haven't found the body yet. The rescue team searched, but the odds aren't good." There was a silence that hung heavy in the air, and I realized I needed to say something. "Anything." "I can't believe this," I whispered, hoping I sounded more convincing than I felt. He can't be gone. He just can't." I trailed off, letting the tears come. They weren't real, but I had learned long ago how to summon them when necessary. "I'm really sorry, Tara," Ethan said, his voice softening. "I know this is a shock. We'll keep you updated as they continue the search, but," he paused, glancing down at the ground. "You should probably prepare yourself for the worst." Officer Greg stepped forward, his brow furrowed with what looked like genuine concern. "I know this is a lot to take in right now. Is there anyone you want us to call? Family? Friends? I shook my head, still clutching my hand to my mouth. No, it's fine. I'll be fine. I wasn't about to invite anyone into this mess. The last thing I needed was people crawling around my life, asking questions. I just needed them to leave so I could think, so I could figure out what this meant for me. Well, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call us, Officer Gregg said gently. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mrs. Campbell. Thank you, I whispered, stepping back and gripping the door as if I needed support. Ethan gave me a tight, apologetic smile before he turned to leave with Officer Gregg. I watched them walk down the path, their figures disappearing into the shadows of the night. My heart was pounding, but not from grief. I closed the door behind me, pressing my back against it and letting out a long, shaky breath. It was over. He was gone. I walked back into the living room, feeling lightheaded. The wine glass still sat on the table, untouched, the red liquid glowing in the firelight. I picked it up and downed the entire thing in one gulp. Then I sat back down on the couch, staring into the fire. Brad was dead. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The house felt unnaturally quiet after Ethan and Officer Gregg left. The ticking of the clock on the mantel was the only sound that filled the space, and it seemed to grow louder with every passing second. I sat back down on the couch, my mind still reeling from the news. Brad was gone. Dead. The words echoed in my head, but they felt distant, almost unreal. I couldn't say I was shocked, not in the way a normal wife would be, anyway. Brad and I hadn't been anything close to a real couple for a long time. The idea of him disappearing from my life wasn't just tolerable, it was desirable. My fingers hovered over my phone. I knew I had to call Nick. He needed to know what had happened, and we needed to figure out what came next. My hand shook as I dialed his number, but it wasn't fear that was causing my nerves to fray, it was excitement. I was on the brink of something new, something better. All I had to do was take the plunge. Nick picked up on the second ring. Hey, babe, he said, his voice warm and familiar. I could almost picture him lounging on his couch, the light from his television flickering in the background. I didn't waste any time. Nick, it's happened. What's happened? His tone shifted immediately, concern creeping into his voice. What are you talking about? I took a breath, steadying myself, trying to keep the rush of emotions in check. Brad's gone. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Gone. What do you mean, gone? He's dead, Nick, I said, a little sharper than I intended. His car went through the ice at the lake. Ethan and a cop came by tonight. They haven't found the body yet, but they're pretty sure he's not coming back. Nick let out a low whistle. Holy shit, are you serious? I'm dead serious, I replied, unable to resist the grim irony of my words. I let out a shaky laugh that probably sounded more hysterical than anything else. He's really gone. There was a beat of silence before Nick's voice returned, quieter this time. Tara, are you okay? I leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. Okay. Nick, I'm better than okay. This is what we've been waiting for. We're free now. We don't have to sneak around anymore. We don't have to hide. I could hear Nick shifting on the other end, the sound of his breath catching as he processed what I was saying. You're right. This changes everything. Exactly, I said, feeling the weight lift from my chest. We don't have to be careful anymore. We can finally leave this place. Together. There was a long pause. I could hear Nick thinking, the gears in his head turning. So what's the plan? I glanced around the house, my eyes settling on the half-empty glass of wine, the remnants of the life I'd been trapped in for too long. I pack a bag tonight, and tomorrow morning, I'm out of here. We can meet up at your place and leave from there. Leave? Nick repeated, the word hanging in the air between us. You mean, for good? Yes, for good. I could hear the urgency creeping into my voice. There's nothing left for me here. No Brad. No future. If I stick around, people are going to start asking questions, poking around in our lives. We need to get out now, before anyone realizes what's really been going on. Nick hesitated. And you're sure about this? Nick, this is what we've wanted, isn't it? I pressed, my pulse quickening. A fresh start. A chance to be together without looking over our shoulders. We can go anywhere. Start new lives. Yeah, he said slowly, his voice sounding more certain now. Yeah, you're right. We can make this work. I'll pack my stuff tonight. We can be out of here by tomorrow morning. Good, I breathed, relief flooding through me. We'll figure out the rest as we go. After hanging up, I stood up from the couch and looked around the living room one last time. This house had been a cage for so long, trapping me in a life I didn't want, tethering me to a man I didn't love. Now, with Brad out of the picture, there was nothing stopping me from leaving it all behind. I hurried upstairs to the bedroom, pulling a suitcase out of the closet and tossing in clothes without much thought. I didn't need to pack everything. Just enough to get by until Nick and I could settle somewhere else. A new town, maybe a new state. Somewhere far from here, where no one knew who I was or what I had done. The thought sent a thrill through me. I was finally free. As I zipped up the suitcase, I heard my phone buzz on the nightstand. I grabbed it, expecting another message from Nick, but instead, it was Ethan. The text was brief, "We're still searching. I'll keep you updated if anything changes." I stared at the screen, a hollow feeling settling in my gut. Ethan, the poor fool. He thought he was doing me a favor by keeping me in the loop. Little did he know, I was already planning my escape. By the time they found Brad, if they ever did, I'd be long gone, and I wouldn't be looking back. I tossed the phone onto the bed and finished packing. Tomorrow, my new life would begin. The next morning, the air felt electric as I loaded my suitcase into the back of my car. I had barely slept, but I wasn't tired. If anything, I was more alive than I had felt in years. I started the engine and began the short drive to Nick's place, my mind racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. When I pulled up outside his apartment, Nick was already standing by the door, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He walked up to my car with a grin, opening the passenger door and tossing his bag in. "Ready?" I asked, my heart thudding in my chest. Nick slid into the seat next to me and glanced over, his eyes bright with excitement. "Ready." As I pulled out of the parking lot, I felt a surge of adrenaline. We were really doing this. Leaving everything behind, just like we had always talked about. For the first time in what felt like forever, I had control over my life. No more Brad, no more pretending. "Where to first?" Nick asked, settling back in his seat. "Anywhere but here," I replied with a smile, feeling the weight of the past lift from my shoulders. We drove in silence for a while, the town fading behind us. As the miles rolled by, I couldn't help but wonder if I had truly escaped or if the consequences of my choices were still chasing me, waiting to catch up. But for now, I didn't care. I was free. Or so I thought. The early morning sun was just beginning to filter through the trees as Nick and I sped down the highway, the excitement of our newfound freedom barely contained. We had barely spoken since leaving town, both of us lost in our thoughts and the thrill of the unknown. The car seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the very air around us was charged with the possibilities of our new life. We had planned to make a few stops along the way, find a cheap motel, get a decent breakfast, and then decide on our next destination. But as we were cruising down the road, my phone buzzed on the dashboard, pulling me from my reverie. I glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. My pulse quickened as I read the message. "Tara, where are you? We need to talk." "Brad," my stomach dropped. "Nick, pull over," I said, my voice trembling. Nick looked over, his brow furrowing with concern. "What's wrong?" "It's Brad. he's trying to reach me. Nick's eyes widened, and he pulled the car over to the side of the road. I stared at the message in disbelief, trying to process the sudden twist. Brad's name had been a ghost in my rearview mirror, and now it seemed he was very much alive. "I thought you said he was dead," Nick said, his voice tinged with confusion and worry. "What's going on?" "I thought he was," I replied, gripping the phone tightly. "But now he's alive. I don't know how, but he must have found out where I was heading." Nick's face paled. "So what do we do?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my head. "We have to go back. I need to find out what's happening." The drive back to town felt endless. The initial excitement of escape was replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The closer we got, the more I dreaded what awaited us. By the time we pulled up to the house, it was late afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Nick parked the car, and we both got out, our footsteps heavy on the gravel. As we approached the house, I could see two figures waiting on the front porch, Brad and Ethan. They were talking quietly, but as soon as they saw us, they both turned their gazes toward us with a mix of satisfaction and irritation. Brad's face broke into a wide, smug smile when he saw us. Well, look who decided to come back." I felt a lump in my throat as I stepped up onto the porch, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. "Brad. I don't understand. How are you here?" Brad's smile grew wider. "I thought you'd like to know. The whole thing, the accident, the search, it was all a setup." I stared at him, disbelief mingling with a surge of anger. "A setup? But why?" Ethan stepped forward, crossing his arms. "Brad and I decided it was time to find out who was really loyal. We needed proof of your, shall we say, commitment. So you faked your own death?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You had me believing you were gone." "Exactly," Brad said, leaning against the railing. "I wanted to see what you'd do. I wanted to see if you'd run off with your lover, which, as it turns out, you did." My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel Nick shifting uncomfortably beside me. "This is insane," I said, shaking my head. "You can't do this. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Brad interrupted, his tone growing cold. "I've got evidence of your affair. I've been collecting it for a while now. I knew you wouldn't be able to resist making a move once you thought I was out of the picture." Nick took a step forward, his expression angry and defiant. "This is bullshit. You can't just trap us like this. We didn't do anything wrong." "Oh, but you did," Ethan chimed in. "And now you're going to pay the price. Brad and I have decided to make this very clear. If you try to contest anything, if you try to fight back, you'll find yourself in a very difficult position." Brad's eyes locked onto mine, filled with a steely determination. "I could drag this out in court, make your life a living hell. Or you can accept the terms I'm about to lay out and walk away." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. "And what are those terms?" Brad straightened up, his posture rigid with authority. "You will leave town immediately. You'll walk away from everything, this house, your assets, everything. You'll take nothing with you, and you'll never come back. If you try to fight this or cause any trouble, I will use every piece of evidence I have against you. You'll lose everything, including any chance at a fair divorce settlement." My mouth went dry as the gravity of the situation sank in. I turned to Nick, who looked equally defeated, his face pale and eyes wide with shock. We can't just walk away from this," Nick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to do something." Brad shook his head. "There's nothing you can do. I've already made arrangements. Ethan and I are heading to Cancun for a vacation, celebrating our little victory. Enjoy your new lives, or lack thereof." As Brad and Ethan turned to leave, their smug faces reflecting the satisfaction of their scheme's success, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. The freedom I had hoped for was slipping away, replaced by the cold reality of Brad's machinations. Nick and I stood on the porch, watching the two men drive off, leaving us with nothing but the hollow remnants of our dreams. The house that had seemed like a prison now felt like a symbol of everything we had lost. "We have to go," Nick said quietly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, feeling a mix of resignation and sadness. "Yeah. We need to leave." As we turned to walk inside and gather what little we had left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much longer, more complicated ordeal. Brad had won this round, but the game was far from over. The house felt emptier than ever. Nick and I had managed to pack up a few essentials, but most of our belongings were left behind, collateral damage of Brad's scheme. We loaded the car with what we could carry and drove away from the house that had been our temporary haven, but now seemed like a monument to our failure. As we drove out of town, the familiar landscape of my life receded in the rearview mirror. Each mile felt like a mile away from the freedom I had imagined. We didn't speak much during the drive. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of our defeat and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. We stopped at a small, roadside diner for a quick meal, hoping that food might provide some clarity. I picked at my plate, barely tasting the food, while Nick stared out the window, lost in thought. "This is ridiculous," Nick said finally, breaking the silence. "How did we let this happen? We were so close." "I don't know," I said, my voice strained. "I thought we had everything figured out. But Brad, he had us cornered." Nick's face was set in a determined frown. "We can't just give up. We need to figure out our next move." I nodded, trying to muster some optimism. "We do. But for now, we need a place to stay and a plan to figure out our finances. We've got nothing." Nick sighed and leaned back in his seat. "Let's head to that cheap motel we passed a few miles back. We can regroup there." The motel was as shabby as it looked from the outside, but it was all we could afford. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and a musty smell, but it was a roof over our heads. We unloaded our bags and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted from the stress of the past few days. I took out my phone, checking for any new messages. There were several missed calls from Ethan, each one a reminder of the ordeal we had endured. I ignored them, focusing instead on trying to make sense of our situation. Nick was pacing the room, clearly agitated. "We need to figure out how to get some money," he said. "We can't just stay here indefinitely." "I know," I replied, rubbing my temples. "I have a few contacts I can reach out to. Maybe they can help us get some cash or at least give us some advice." Nick stopped pacing and looked at me. "We need to be smart about this. If we start making calls, we might attract unwanted attention. We have to be careful." I nodded, feeling the pressure of our situation weighing heavily on me. "I'll make a few discreet inquiries. In the meantime, we should figure out what our next steps are. We need to find a more permanent solution." Later that evening, I managed to contact a former colleague who agreed to lend me a small amount of money in exchange for a favor in the future. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover a few days' expenses. It felt like a temporary fix to a much larger problem, but it was something. As I sat on the edge of the bed, Nick came over and sat beside me. "So what now?" he asked, his tone weary. "We need to lay low for a while," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We should find a place where we can stay for a few weeks, figure out our finances, and plan our next move. We need to make sure we don't get caught up in any more trouble." Nick nodded, rubbing his temples. "And what about Brad and Ethan? What if they come looking for us?" "We'll cross that bridge when we get to it," I said. "For now, we need to focus on surviving and getting back on our feet." Days turned into weeks. We managed to find a small apartment in a neighboring city where no one knew us. It was a modest place, but it was ours, and it offered a semblance of normalcy. I kept in touch with a few old friends and continued to work on rebuilding our financial situation. It wasn't easy, but it was better than living out of a motel. One evening, as we sat on the small balcony of our new apartment, Nick and I finally had a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The sky was clear, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "Do you ever think about going back?" Nick asked, his voice contemplative. I looked out at the horizon, feeling a mix of emotions. Sometimes I think about what we lost and what could have been. But I know we can't go back. Brad and Ethan made sure of that. Nick took my hand, squeezing it gently. We've been through a lot. But we're still here. We're making it work. I turned to him, offering a small smile. We are. And we'll keep moving forward. One step at a time. As we sat together, the reality of our situation began to settle in. We had lost much, but we had each other and a chance to rebuild. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep us going. Brad and Ethan had won this round, but our story wasn't over. We would find a way to move on and create a new life, one where we were in control of our own fate. For now, that was enough.